The exact moment I became the most despised man in Oakwood Heights was, ironically, the exact same second I became its king, though nobody knew it yet, not even me. $350,000. That is the number, the precise, life-ruining figure that Karen Vance and her little army of clipboard-wielding tyrants demanded from me for the high crime of watering my dead wife's hydrangeas. They saw a stubborn old man clinging to a patch of dirt in the middle of their manicured suburban paradise, a relic that needed to be paved over. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly have known because their arrogance blinded them, was that I was sitting on 340 acres of receipts, deeds, and a 33-year-old secret that was about to turn their entire world upside down. If you are hiding in the break room at work or sitting in your car, dreading going home to your own nightmare neighbors, listen closely, because what happened to me is going to make you want to stand up and cheer. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 58 years old, and I have breathed the air on this land every single day of my life. My grandfather, a man built of grit and tobacco smoke, bought this earth back in 1952 when Fairview County was nothing but cow pastures and silence, and he built the stone farmhouse where I sleep, raised the livestock that fed us, and carved a life out of the clay. Martha and I, we moved into the main house the day after our wedding 35 years ago, and she poured her soul into that soil, specifically that quarter-acre plot by the creek where she grew the prize-winning pumpkins and herbs that she'd give away to anyone who asked. When the sickness took Martha 2 years ago, that garden stopped being just a garden and became a shrine, a holy place where I could still hear her humming while I pulled weeds, a place where I could keep a piece of her alive. But time doesn't stop for grief. And while we were living our quiet life, the world closed in around us, specifically in the form of Oakwood Heights, a sprawling development of 127 luxury homes that swallowed the farmland around us in the 90s, bringing with it gates, security codes, and people who panic if their grass grows an eighth of an inch too high. We got along fine for decades, staying in our lane while they stayed in theirs, until Karen Vance rolled into town in a silver Mercedes that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined, wearing a blazer that looked like it was tailored by a shark and carrying an attitude that smelled like old money and new cruelty. She became the HOA president last spring on a platform of modernization, which is corporate speak for destroying anything that looks like it has character, and her eyes landed squarely on my property, specifically Martha's garden, which she decided was an unapproved agricultural eyesore in a residential zone. The first fine was $2,500, a slap in the face that I tried to ignore, but then came the attack on the perimeter fence, the stone and wire barrier my grandfather laid by hand in '52, which she labeled a non-conforming boundary, hitting me with another $8,500 ticket. Then she went after the old tool shed where Martha used to pot her seedlings, slapping a $15,000 fine on it for being an unpermitted structure. And with every letter that arrived in my mailbox, I felt like I was being erased, like she wasn't just attacking my wallet, but was systematically dismantling the memory of the woman I loved. But Karen was just warming up because she brought in her brother-in-law, a city inspector named Officer Higgins, a man with a sweaty upper lip and a clipboard who looked at my life and saw only violations. They came for the gravel driveway that had carried 4 generations of Pendletons, calling it a dust hazard, and demanding I pave it to city code for $85,000, and they came for the stone chimney, claiming it was structurally unsound for another $45,000. The fine snowballed, $50,000, $100,000, $200,000, and my insurance company sent cancellation threats while the bank started mailing foreclosure warnings, forcing me to sell Martha's antique vanity just to keep the lights on, watching pieces of our history walk out the door to pay for Karen's ego. The breaking point, the moment the universe shifted, happened on a Tuesday morning when I watched that silver Mercedes crawl up my driveway like a predator, followed by a city truck, and out stepped Karen, checking her watch, while Officer Higgins waddled behind her, and for 2 hours I stood there and watched them invent problems. They cited the hand-carved shutters, the rain gutters that worked perfectly fine, even the old weeping willow tree where Martha hung wind chimes, claiming the branches were a safety liability. And when they were done, Higgins handed me a stack of paper thick enough to be a phone book, containing 47 new violations and a 30-day deadline to fix them or face daily penalties. I stood on my porch as they drove away, holding that stack of paper, the total now pushing $250,000, and something inside me didn't just break, it calcified. Martha always told me I was too soft, too willing to let people step on me to keep the peace. But looking at those citations, I realized this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the right to exist. It was about my grandfather's sweat and my wife's memory, and I decided right then and there that if they wanted a war, I would give them a nuclear winter. I went to the county courthouse the next morning, descending into the basement archives where the air smelled of mildew and secrets, and I started pulling every deed, survey, and map related to the original Prestige Homes Incorporated development from the late 80s, because I remembered something my grandfather had said, something about leasing rights, not selling land. It took me 3 days of digging through misfiled boxes, dodging the glare of the county clerk, a nervous woman named Brenda, who seemed oddly unhelpful when I asked for the older files, claiming they were lost or damaged. But I found it, buried in a box marked Miscellaneous Projects 1987, a carbon copy of a contract with my grandfather's jagged signature on the bottom, a document that hinted at a reality so wild I almost didn't believe it. It suggested that when Prestige Homes Incorporated built this subdivision, they didn't buy the land, they leased the development rights, like renting a canvas to paint on, but keeping the canvas itself. The fines were hitting $500 a day now, and Karen called an emergency HOA meeting to fast-track a foreclosure on my home, sending me a notice from her high-powered law firm, Shark and Stone LLP, claiming I had 30 days to vacate or face criminal trespassing charges on the land I was born on. I called my daughter, Samantha, an environmental lawyer out in Seattle who eats corporate bullies for breakfast, and when I read her the foreclosure notice, the silence on the line was heavy until she said, "Dad, HOAs can't foreclose in 30 days without a hearing. This isn't legal. Don't sign anything. I'm flying home." But I needed more than just a lawyer. I needed a historian. So I hired Mrs. Gable, a 7-year-old genealogy wizard who knows where every skeleton in the county is buried, and she dug up the original survey maps from 1987. She called me 2 days later, her voice trembling, and said, "Arthur, you need to sit down, because if these maps are right, your grandfather's 340 acres didn't just stop at your fence line. They encompassed the entire footprint of Oakwood Heights. Every house, every pool, every cul-de-sac is sitting on Pendleton dirt." This was the bomb I had been waiting for, but to detonate it, we needed proof that the land was never sold. So we tracked down Old Man Rivers, the surveyor who mapped the place 35 years ago. He met me at a diner, sketching lines on a napkin with shaking hands, explaining that my grandfather understood the difference between surface rights and subsurface ownership, essentially selling the icing but keeping the cake. But the clock was ticking, because Karen's lawyers filed a countersuit for $2.3 million claiming adverse possession, arguing that because the neighborhood had been there for 30 years, they owned it by default, a legal move so aggressive it was meant to crush me before I could take another breath. I was reading their lawsuit in Martha's garden, surrounded by overturned earth where Karen had trespassed to rip up my tomato plants, when I noticed a detail in the footnotes about the 1991 bankruptcy of Prestige Homes Incorporated, the developer. I called Mrs. Gable back and told her to find the bankruptcy lawyer, a man named Mr. Calloway, who was rotting away in a retirement home in Florida. And when we finally got him on the phone, he laughed a dry, rasping laugh and said, "I've been waiting 30 years for a Pendleton to call me." Mr. Calloway was 81 years old, but his memory was sharper than a razor blade, and he explained the magic words, equitable reversion. He told me that when Prestige Homes Incorporated went belly up in '91, they hadn't finished paying my grandfather for the land purchase, meaning the contract was voided, and under federal bankruptcy law, the ownership snapped back to the seller like a rubber band. He said, "Son, those people in Oakwood Heights think they bought homes, but the company that sold them the deeds didn't own the dirt they were building on, so legally, you have been the landlord of that entire subdivision for 3 decades." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Karen Vance, the woman trying to evict me, the woman destroying Martha's sanctuary, was living in a house she didn't own, on land that belonged to me, issuing fines for violations on my property while she was the one trespassing. Mr. Calloway agreed to overnight the certified originals of the bankruptcy filings, documents that were immune to local tampering, which was lucky because things in Fairview County were about to get dirty. 2 days before the big showdown, I was driving past the courthouse after hours when I saw something that made my stomach turn. Brenda's sedan was parked around back near the loading dock, and right next to it was the unmistakable silver Mercedes of Karen Vance. I parked across the street, killed my lights, and watched through the chain-link fence as Karen handed Brenda a thick, white envelope, the kind that looks innocent but feels heavy. And Brenda didn't look happy. She looked terrified, shaking her head until Karen grabbed her arm and shoved the envelope into her purse. 20 minutes later, Brenda came out carrying a banker's box marked Property Records 1980 to 1989, and I followed her, my heart hammering against my ribs, tailing her car to the city waste management facility where she unlocked the gate and tossed that entire box into the industrial incinerator. I sat there in the dark, filming the orange glow of the fire on my phone, watching 30 years of public records turn to ash, realizing that Karen knew exactly how weak her claim was, and she was willing to burn history to save her own skin. The next morning, Samantha and I walked into the courthouse and asked to see the 1987 deed records, and Brenda, looking pale and sweaty, told us those files were damaged in a water leak and were unavailable. Samantha didn't blink. She just leaned over the counter and said, "That's fascinating, Brenda, because my father has 4K video of you throwing those specific boxes into a furnace last night after accepting a bribe from Karen Vance." You have never seen a human being deflate faster than Brenda did in that moment. She dissolved into tears, confessing right there that Karen had paid her $15,000 to destroy the evidence because nobody needs those old papers anyway. But we didn't need Brenda's copies, because Samantha had already pulled the nuclear option. She had contacted the State Land Commission, where Mr. Calloway had filed duplicate records 30 years ago, records that were stored in a climate-controlled vault in the state capitol, far beyond the reach of small-town corruption. While the State Ethics Board launched an immediate investigation into Brenda and Karen, completely unaware that the walls were closing in, doubled down, issuing a final citation that brought my total fines to exactly $350,000 and slapping a criminal trespassing notice on my front gate, threatening to have me arrested if I didn't vacate my own home within 24 hours. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She was accusing me of trespassing on the very land that she was illegally occupying, projecting her own crimes onto me with the confidence of a sociopath. The notice for the emergency HOA meeting went out that Friday, labeled mandatory attendance, where the board planned to vote on a special assessment of $25,000 per household to fund a legal defense trust. Samantha's friend, a forensic accountant, followed the money trail and found that this trust wasn't an HOA account at all, but a shell company called Vance Legal Solutions LLC, fully owned by Karen, meaning she was planning to trick her neighbors into giving her $3 million to fight a battle she knew she had already lost. We decided we weren't just going to win, we were going to end this publicly. We teamed up with Jennifer Vale, an investigative reporter who specialized in white-collar fraud, and we rigged the community center with cameras to live-stream the meeting to the entire town. On Sunday night, the hall was packed with angry, confused residents who couldn't understand why they needed to cough up 25 grand, and Karen stood at the podium, looking impeccable in her pearls, spinning a tale about a deranged, senile neighbor who was trying to extort the community with fake documents. She played the victim perfectly, warning them that if they didn't pay up, property values would crash, unaware that Jennifer Vale was broadcasting her every lie to a growing audience on Facebook Live. Karen admitted, in a slip of the tongue fueled by arrogance, that she had known about the title discrepancies for months, but considered them irrelevant, effectively confessing that she had been issuing fines while knowing she had no legal authority. That was our cue. Samantha stood up from the back row and shouted, "Mrs. Vance, if you knew about the title issues, why didn't you disclose that your legal defense fund is a personal shell company registered in your name?" The room went deadly silent. The air sucked out of the space as residents turned to look at us, and then to their phones where the live stream comments were exploding with links to the business registry. Then, Old Man Rivers stood up and clicked a remote, and the projector screen behind Karen changed to display the 1987 survey map overlaid with the current neighborhood, showing indisputably that every single house was sitting inside the Pendleton property lines. Old Man Rivers cleared his throat and said in a voice that scraped like gravel, "Folks, you haven't been paying mortgages. You've been paying a con artist. You're all living on Arthur's land." I walked to the front of the room carrying a box of 127 envelopes, and the sound of my boots on the linoleum was the only thing you could hear. I looked at Karen, whose face had drained of all color, leaving her looking like a wax statue, and I turned to the room. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," I said, my voice shaking just a little before finding its steel. "And I own the ground beneath your feet." The silence didn't last long. It broke like a fever, replaced by a roar of confusion and panic as I began handing out the envelopes, assisted by Samantha and our legal team. Inside each packet was a simple, terrifying truth: a formal notice of trespassing, a copy of the bankruptcy decree, and a letter explaining that for 33 years, their deeds had been worthless paper sold by a bankrupt fraudster. Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel and screaming for order, but her power had evaporated the moment the truth hit the air. "You can't do this," Karen shrieked, her voice cracking, losing that polished veneer. "I am the president of this association. I will have you arrested." "Actually," Samantha interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife, "you won't be arresting anyone." She pointed to the back of the room where the double doors swung open, revealing the state police and the FBI, led by a stern-faced agent named Detective Miller. They walked down the center aisle, the heavy clink of handcuffs audible over the gasps of the crowd, and Detective Miller read Karen her rights right there on the stage, charging her with wire fraud, embezzlement, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to commit title fraud. The camera crews zoomed in as Karen was led away in cuffs, still sputtering about architectural committees and grass height, completely unable to process that her reign of terror was over. But once the villain was gone, I was left looking at 127 terrified families, my neighbors, who were suddenly realizing they were homeless in their own homes, victims of a massive deception that went back decades. I took the microphone, the feedback squealing for a second, and looked at Mrs. Henderson, a sweet lady in the front row who was clutching her chest. "I didn't come here to ruin your lives," I told them. "I came here to stop Karen from ruining mine." I explained my offer. They could purchase the land their houses sat on for the original 1987 price of $89,000, a steal in today's market. Or they could sign a lease with the Pendleton Land Trust for a fixed rate that wouldn't go up for 5 years. The relief in the room was palpable, a physical wave of tension releasing as they realized I wasn't there to evict them, but to liberate them. The HOA was dissolved that night, its power shattered, replaced by a simple community group dedicated to potlucks and block parties rather than measuring fences. 6 months later, Karen Vance traded her luxury suite for a federal prison cell, sentenced to 15 years for her crimes, while Brenda got probation and a permanent ban from government work for turning evidence against her. The investigation revealed that Prestige Homes Incorporated had run this scam in 3 other states, and my fight had toppled a domino chain of fraud across the country. But the real victory wasn't the legal win, it was what happened to the neighborhood. With the HOA restrictions dead, the fences came down, metaphorically and literally. Oakwood Heights stopped looking like a sterile prison and started looking like a community. People planted gardens, painted their doors colors other than beige, and kids started running through the yards again. As for me, I'm still in the stone farmhouse, but I'm not alone anymore. Samantha moved her practice into the old tool shed, which we renovated and legally permitted, and she specializes in helping rural families fight land grabbers. And Martha's garden? It's bigger than ever. The neighbors, the ones who used to look down on me, now come over on weekends to learn how to grow tomatoes, and we built a community patch right where Karen tried to pave over my memories. Standing there at sunset, watching the fireflies dance over the hydrangeas that Martha loved so much, I realized that justice isn't just about punishing the wicked. It's about restoring the balance. Karen tried to use the law as a weapon to destroy a legacy, but she forgot that the law, like the land, has a memory, and it doesn't take kindly to thieves. We won the war for Broken Arrow Farm, but it leaves a burning question that keeps me up at night. I chose mercy. I let the family stay for cheap. I didn't demand the 30 years of back rent I was legally owed, which would have been millions of dollars. But there are people online who say I was a fool, that I should have evicted everyone and sold the land to the highest bidder to punish the system that let this happen. So I ask you, if you found out you own the entire neighborhood that had been tormenting you for years, would you have offered them a handshake and a lease? Or would you have burned it all down and taken every penny? Let me know in the comments, because in this world, sometimes being right is the heaviest burden of all.